over reports of a spy in his 2016 campaign. The U.S. and China agreed to make reductions to the U.S. trade deficit, a deal long on optimism but short on specifics, and House Republican leadership in turmoil as crucial midterm elections approach. This is Special Report. Good evening, I'm Bret Baier. We are coming to you tonight from the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California. More on why I'm here a bit later in the show. We begin on the other coast, however, as President Trump meets with 3 of his top national security officials after calling for a major investigation into reports the FBI had a plant, an informant, a spy, whatever you want to call it, in his presidential campaign in 2016. President Trump especially wants to find out what his predecessor, President Obama, knew about it. Judging by his tweets, the 45th president clearly considers this part of a big conspiracy. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge starts us off tonight with the investigation. Good evening, Catherine.
Brett, in a statement late today, the White House press secretary said there's an agreement for the president's chief of staff, John Kelly, to immediately bring together law enforcement and intelligence agencies with congressional leaders so that lawmakers can view the highly classified records they requested long ago.
A White House official said the president's concerns about an alleged FBI informant would be raised at the meeting, which included Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, who has oversight of the Russia Special Counsel probe, FBI Director Christopher Wray, and Dan Coats, the nation's intelligence chief. After the president's weekend tweet calling on the Justice Department to investigate claims about the informant, the department quickly announced Sunday the expansion of an internal investigation into alleged government surveillance abuse. The new line of inquiry will consider whether there was any impropriety or political motivation in how the FBI obtained surveillance warrants or used informants to collect intelligence. The vice president told Fox's Martha McCallum the administration wants clarity and closure.
The president, I think, is grateful that the Department of Justice is going to have the Inspector General look into it and determine and ensure that there was no surveillance done for political purposes against our campaign. I think it would be very troubling to millions of Americans if that took place.
A source close to the matter tells Fox News that the Republican chairman of the House Intelligence and Oversight Committees, Devin Nunes and Trey Gowdy, want a discrete set of records, about 200, related to the intelligence source and whether their work was used in the Russia case or to obtain surveillance warrants on Carter Page, a Trump campaign aide.
All we're asking for is give us the documentation that you used to start this investigation.
On the Senate floor, the minority leader said the president's call for a parallel investigation set a bad precedent.
President Trump seems to have the terribly misguided view that the Department of Justice is there to protect his political interests and prosecute his enemies.
The president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, claims that earlier this month he spoke with special counsel Robert Mueller about the investigation ending by September 1st if the president agreed to a mid-July interview. Giuliani said the two men also talked about the alleged FBI informant. Giuliani said Mueller's interview with the president should be contingent on Giuliani having access to the informant.
Source familiar with the discussion said tonight lawmakers are waiting to learn more details about the proposed meeting, the timing, and whether all records requested by Congress, including those related to an alleged FBI informant, will be made available. Brett.
Kevin, thank you. More on this with the panel. Wall Street had a big day on news of a possible trade agreement between the U.S. and China. The Dow gained 298 today. The S&P 500 was up 20. The Nasdaq finished ahead 40. President Trump is celebrating this development, but some experts are saying China may be pulling a fast one on the U.S., and there is already a significant amount of hedging from both sides tonight. Correspondent Kristen Fisher reports from the White House this evening.
I, Gina Haspel, do solemnly swear.
Before presiding over the swearing-in ceremony of the new CIA Director Gina Haspel, President Trump unloaded on Twitter about his administration's approach to resolving a trade war with China, noting that China has agreed to buy massive amounts of additional farm and agricultural products and that barriers and tariffs will come down. After months of threatening to impose stiff tariffs on Chinese steel and aluminum, the Treasury Secretary made this bold declaration on Fox News Sunday.
We're putting the trade war on hold. So right now we have agreed to put the tariffs on hold while we try to execute the framework.
Secretary Mnuchin says that framework includes China's agreement to substantially reduce the trade deficit by increasing their purchases of goods. But when asked exactly by how much, the secretary wouldn't say.
There was a reason why we didn't put a specific number, and I would also say the specific number, again, whatever we agree to, these are not government-to-government purchases. We have very specific targets, industry by industry. These now have to be executed.
The Trump administration describes last week's talks with the Chinese and the framework it produced as substantial progress, and the markets responded accordingly as fears of a global trade war between the world's two biggest economies subsided. But today, there are bipartisan fears that this potential deal is letting the Chinese off the hook on one of its biggest transgressions. Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer urged the Trump administration to not sell out for a temporary purchase of goods without addressing the real issue, the theft of American intellectual property. While Republican Senator Marco Rubio said any deal that doesn't stop China from cyber theft and forcing U.S. companies to transfer technology to them is a huge loss.
So it's unclear if that issue, the theft of American intellectual property, is still on the negotiating table. As for what's next, the Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross is heading to China next week to try to turn this initial framework into an actual signed agreement. Brett?
Kristen Fisher live at the White House. Kristen, thank you. President Trump is also calling on China to keep up pressure on North Korea by sealing their shared border until a nuclear weapons agreement is reached. This comes on the eve of a meeting between the president and South Korea's leader. Correspondent Benjamin Hall has details.
President Moon of South Korea flew to Washington today ahead of President Trump's planned summit with Kim Jong-un, hoping to shore up plans after a number of setbacks. Trust between the US and North Korea hit shaky ground recently after Pyongyang's surprise move to break off a high-level meeting with Seoul, apparently because of recent US-South Korean military drills, which they call a rehearsal for invasion. They also threatened to cancel next month's summit. But in a tweet today, President Trump concluded by saying, "I want this to happen and North Korea to be very successful, but only after signing." Following years of provocations, though, others issued harsher warnings if North Korea pulled out.
I talked to the president 2 or 3 days ago. He's not going to be played. They're trying to run out the clock. They have a record of promising to give up their nuclear weapons. In reality, they build up their weapons. They've done this for 30 years. It's going to end one way or the other.
The first big test will come this week, when North Korea is due to destroy the Pyongyang nuclear test site in full view of international observers and journalists. Calling off that event, praised by President Trump as a show of good faith, would also be a major blow to ongoing negotiations. And this is not the first time North Korea has carried out such a show. In 2008, they destroyed a cooling tower at a nuclear plant in a symbolic show of its commitment to giving up its nuclear ambitions, only to conduct a far more powerful test the following year, something that the US will no longer tolerate. So despite the apparent success of that meeting between President Moon and Kim Jong-un just last month, the US is now moving more cautiously, aware of past mistakes. Brett?
Benjamin Hall in London. Benjamin, thank you. The Trump administration is outlining the terms of a proposed new nuclear deal with Iran. America's top diplomat is threatening what he calls the strongest sanctions in history if Iran does not comply. Iran is predictably dismissive. Correspondent Rich Edson has specifics from the State Department tonight.
The United States will implement an aggressive campaign to economically isolate and punish Iran.
These will indeed end up being the strongest sanctions in history when we are complete.
Borrowing a tactic and even a name from the administration's North Korea policy, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo promises an historic pressure campaign against Iran. State Department officials say they will continue working with allies to create a global coalition to counter Iran. Secretary Pompeo also warned companies from allied countries conducting business with Iran that the United States would penalize them if they continued working with Iran. All part of what the administration says is a robust strategy to address Iran's behavior beyond nuclear activity.
We will track down Iranian operatives and their Hezbollah proxies operating around the world, and we will crush them. Iran will never again have carte blanche to dominate the Middle East.
Pompeo listed a dozen U.S. demands. Among them, Iran must abandon its nuclear work in perpetuity, provide international inspectors unqualified access, halt its ballistic missile program, release detained Americans, and end support for Middle East militant groups. In exchange, the secretary says the U.S. would lift sanctions and welcome Iran's return to the global economy. In response, Iran's foreign minister tweeted, quote, U.S. diplomacy sham is merely a regression to old habits, imprisoned by delusions and failed policies, dictated by corrupt special interest. It repeats the same wrong choices and will thus reap the same ill rewards. British Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson, speaking just ahead of Secretary Pompeo, says a larger agreement addressing all of Iran's aggressive behavior won't be very easy to achieve in a reasonable time. Brett?
Rich Edson at the State Department. Rich, thank you. Let's talk about all of these foreign policy challenges with Brian Hook, Senior Policy Advisor to the Secretary of State. He joins us tonight from Washington. Brian, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Brett. Good to be with you.
Let's start with Iran and what Secretary Pompeo said today. How realistic does the Secretary, does the State Department, does the administration believe that these 12 stipulations will actually be agreed to eventually by Iran?
The list of requirements that Secretary Pompeo called out today in his speech on Iran is a very reasonable and realistic list. In fact, if you go through the list, it focuses on things like Iran's nuclear weapons program, its support for terrorism, its foreign wars that it funds around the Middle East, its violation of human rights. All of these are positions that the United States and its European allies have held at one time or another. And so this is the kind of new approach that we are taking to create a new security architecture in the context of the totality of Iran's threats.
Yeah, here's someone who negotiated before, former Ambassador Wendy Sherman, talking about this.
I think that Pompeo gave us a wish list today, and it's a wish list probably everybody could agree to, but you can't get it all at once because then you're negotiating against yourself as one is traded off against the other.
You respond to that?
Well, I think that's a very defeatist attitude, and I think that when it comes to addressing the full range of Iranian threats, we do need to take a comprehensive and very ambitious approach. And the speech that Secretary Pompeo delivered today does exactly that.
Yeah. On the tweet coming from the Iranians, at the end of it, it references that Iran is still working with European partners to continue the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement that the U.S. pulled out of. How much of a problem is that going forward, and how do you calculate that in?
I think that the United States and its European allies share a very similar threat assessment, and we've been working with them over the last few months to address the deficiencies of the Iran nuclear deal. We also made progress on all of the malign activities that fall outside of just the nuclear program. And I think a lot of that foundational work can be built upon, but we're not just limiting our work to the European allies. Secretary Pompeo has invited nations from around the world that share his concerns to join us in this diplomatic effort. We are looking to work with nations who are sick and tired of Iran's quest for a nuclear weapon, who are tired of Iran's terrorism, for its funding and fueling sectarian violence, for violating human rights. We've set forth a very ambitious agenda that we think much of the world can get behind.
I want to touch on two other quick things, but finally on Iran. What do you say to critics who look at this and say this really isn't about another deal, it's about regime change or the possibility of regime change?
The only thing that we'd like to see is a change in the behavior of the Iranian regime. And it's not just the United States, it's the Iranian people. The longest suffering victims of the Iranian regime are the Iranian people. And they are looking for a better life and a better future. They've had protests where they've expressed this. They would like to have better economics. They're tired of their government funding foreign wars and robbing from the Iranian economy to sow instability across the Middle East. And so we think that we've set forth the kind of positive vision that could actually change relations with Iran. The Secretary put on the table that if Iran is ready to change its behavior, we're ready to talk about a range of benefits, including full diplomatic ties, welcoming Iran into the global economy, and other things that would materially improve the lives of the Iranian people.
Well, it's a similar negotiation with North Korea. As we sit here today, what do you think the likelihood is that the June 12th summit moves forward between President Trump and Kim Jong-un?
Well, Secretary Pompeo has now made 2 trips to North Korea to try to set the table for a successful meeting in Singapore on June 12th. These sorts of things take twists and turns. That's not uncommon with North Korea. And so all we can do is try to be in a state of readiness and to do what we can so that we can have a very good discussion about, as President Trump has talked about, a very bright future for the North Korean people if the regime is willing to denuclearize.
And last thing, for the people up on Capitol Hill, people who are skeptical of how this is all coming together, what do you tell them that the administration, the president, is not going to give the store away or is not going to get played by either North Korea or China in negotiations ongoing?
Well, I think the president is coming in from a position of great strength. He has assembled the largest sanctions campaign against North Korea in history. And so he's in a very good position, whether the talks happen or not, whether the talks go well or poorly. The global maximum pressure campaign is going to continue until we achieve our national security objectives.
Brian Hook, Director of Policy of the State Department, thanks for being here. Love to have you back.
Okay, thanks, Brett.
When we come back, Venezuela in turmoil. The U.S. calls yesterday's presidential election a sham. We'll give reaction.